people of this land make their home in the forests. They leave the wigwams of their villages to hunt or to fight rival tribes for control of the best hunting grounds. Their clothing is made from the skins of the animals they kill for food. They peel the bark of trees to make canoes that take them swiftly over lakes and rivers. Their tools are primitive, but they have many skills now lost to man. The skills they need for survival in the wilderness. Their light canoes are well suited to the Indians' needs, for they can move in very shallow water, and their shell-like hulls can be maneuvered skillfully between the sharp rocks of the rapids. While these men know nothing of the world beyond their shores, they know every turn in their rivers and every pathway through their forests.
In the beginning, we found forests and we felled them, wantonly at first, then more carefully. For we needed shelter, protection from the elements and preying beasts, little scattered, separated kingdoms, each called home. We had land, lots of it, rich but untamed, and with honest sweat we cleared it, turned it to our needs, used its richness, made it productive.
The other week, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services removed 22 animals and 1 plant from the endangered species list, officially declaring them extinct. Perhaps the most notable of these, or at least the one that seemed to garner the most media coverage, was the Ivorybilled Woodpecker. But I'll be honest, as somebody who lives in the US, well, I'm pretty sure I've seen this bird before. I mean, I'm by no means an expert bird spotter, but a big ass bird with a huge red crest on its head knocking loudly on trees is pretty hard to miss. By now, it's probably only been a few years since I think I last saw one of these out in the woods. Could this bird really have gone extinct just in that time? To clear up my confusion on this, what better resource could I ask for than Peterson's Field Guide on the Birds of Eastern and Central North America that I may or may not have stolen from my mom. Turning to page 216, we'll find the page on woodpeckers. And sure enough, can you see it right there? It's the Ivorybilled woodpecker, which we can see here has been labeled as presumably extinct. Now, the fact that this bird was already thought to be gone all the way back when this book was published in 2002, with the last confirmed sighting in the US happening in 1944, means that in reality, this bird has likely been extinct for my entire life, and it was probably the very similar looking pileated woodpecker that I was mistaking it for. While in this book, the pileated woodpecker is considered uncommon, the map given for its range shows us that if you go into the woods basically anywhere in the eastern US enough, you have a good chance of spotting it. Reading the little blurb on each bird given in this book, we'll see that the Ivorybilled woodpecker was separated from the pileated woodpecker by its slightly larger size, ivory white bill, and large white wing patch visible at rest. That's what I think this little arrow is pointing to right here. As for the bird's range, it reads formerly river bottom forests of southeast US and Cuba. Hearing that, however, made me realize that even if it were still alive today, I likely never would have seen it, as I live in the northeast of the country. Add this to the fact that we still have what's basically an identical bird to everyone except the most experienced bird spotters, which again, I am not, and honestly, it's hard to feel that bad for the loss of this bird. But this definitely got me curious. I mean, I just finished making a whole series of videos almost exclusively about extinct birds, but the ones I covered were, for the most part, not from where I'm from. And come on, let's be real, even if dodos were still around today, I likely never would have made the trip all the way out to Mauritius just to see one. I guess maybe I would have seen one in like a zoo, but that's different. Either way, this got me wondering, what about the birds that actually did live in the same place that I do? Surely the ivory-billed woodpecker isn't the first bird to be driven to extinction in this area. And it would appear that I have the perfect tool for figuring out and learning about some of the birds that I would have seen had I been alive just 100 years ago, or in other words, the birds I never met. Before I really get into things, first I think it makes sense to actually establish where I live and the story behind this land. As many of you may know, I'm from New York, not the city but the state, and like the rest of the country, and really the rest of the continent, this is a settler society.
Ulster County, New York is one beautiful place to live.
What this means is that not too long ago, a bunch of people an ocean away left their homes to come here and begin new lives away from the harsh conditions many were experiencing in Europe at the time. Before this, these lands were inhabited by a diverse collection of Native American tribes, many of which held in their own cultures, traditions, and religions a respect for the natural world. Add on top of that their much smaller populations when compared to the densely populated Europe, and that's all to say much of the natural environment here was left intact prior to the arrival of European settlers.
The Seneca Indians living along the banks of the Allegheny River in New York State also feel a reverence for the water and the land. It is evident in their campgrounds and their boating facilities at Allegheny Reservoir.
Of course, this all changed over the 1600s as the first colonists arrived on the North American continent from England, Spain, France, the Netherlands, and really everywhere on the other side of the Atlantic.
But settlers from the English colonies want homes. And now the sound of their axes shatters the silence of the forest. Where the trees fall, homes will rise. Branches are burned to clear the soil for planting. Corn and vegetables will soon grow between the tree stumps.
Like virtually every settler colony, the first population centers to arise would all be found where these people disembarked, the coastline.
There was little, if any, settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, and all the colonies were situated along the eastern Atlantic seaboard, from Massachusetts in the north to Georgia in the south.
From this point on, they'd depend heavily on the bountifully preserved continent they'd so happened upon, discovering natural riches far surpassing the tired old world of Europe.
The first faint rays in the dawn of American history disclosed to the earliest settlers the accumulated wealth of countless thousands of years. From the beginning of time, nature had used this vast, almost uninhabited continent as a treasure house for her abundant riches. The dense forest front effectively shrouded in mystery all that lay beyond, holding within its depths a world such as we in our time have never known.
And this settlement pattern along the coast is reflected in the first bird to be driven extinct in the region. Technically a seabird, the Labrador duck had a range spanning much of the east coast of North America. Here, the duck mostly stuck to the sandy shorelines and only ventured deeper inland through bays and inlets, spending its summers across northern Canada or the Labrador coast, and migrated south to the beaches of places like Cape Cod and New Jersey during the winter. But if you're paying close attention, you might have noticed the range of the Labrador duck actually lies outside of the area that I described as being where I'm from. Meaning, I guess, technically, I might not have ever gotten to see this bird in its native habitat. But I have reason to believe that's not actually true, and this has to do with the last Labrador duck ever seen. You see, if we check back to our field guide on page 72, I think we'll find sea ducks or scoters, and if we look closely, we'll see the Labrador duck gets a mention. Its label reads Inset, Labrador Duck, extinct 1878. While this isn't a lot to go on, that date, 1878, is quite specific, and that's because it refers to a pretty well-documented event. It was December 10th, and a great storm came over the whole eastern United States for 2 full days. Through the snow and the rain, a teenage boy left his home in Elmira, New York, a city, I kid you not, is less than an hour drive from where I live now. This boy was equipped with his shotgun, presumably loaded with duckshot shells, and shot himself a number of birds, what would be his food for the next few days. Of all the birds he returned with, one of them stood out from the rest, having a white head, white wings, and a yellow bill tipped with a bluish-black rim. Word of this boy's peculiar catch soon spread to a local bird enthusiast, William H. Gregg, who came as soon as he could to inspect what sounded like a specimen of the rarest bird known to the people of the area. By the time Gregg arrived 2 days later, the head of the bird was all that was left, the rest having been skinned and eaten. Thanks to the duck's unique bill, however, this was still enough to allow the specimen to be identified. Gregg wrote that the first specimen of Labrador duck known to occur in this locality was taken December 12, 1878. It is rare everywhere, and its occurrence so far south in the interior gives special interest to the subject. Not only was this bird rare, this was in fact the very last time a living Labrador duck was ever recorded. Why this seabird was so far inland remains a mystery, though if I had to guess, I'd say it was probably related to the massive storm battering the entire coast, possibly forcing the duck to take shelter further inland, or simply blew it off course. But either way, considering the last recorded living Labrador duck was sighted not even an hour away from where I live, I'm gonna go ahead and say I probably would have seen this duck at least once or twice if it were still around today, despite not currently living exactly within its native range. Now before moving on, I should probably mention that we don't actually know why the Labrador duck went extinct as fast as it did. Being the very first North American bird to go extinct following the arrival of Europeans, we don't actually know much about what it ate, where it bred, where it laid its eggs, how it nested, or even simply how it behaved. By some measures, it's even thought the duck was already endangered by the time settlers arrived, thanks to its precarious reliance on uncommon environments. But I suspect the duck's native range being almost perfectly aligned with the earliest population centers of colonial America had the biggest impact. And so whether it was through hunting, habitat loss, or egg poaching, which was a thing too, it was certainly still the activities of humans that ultimately drove the duck to its demise. Of course, as time went on and more people came over from Europe, it wasn't just the coastlines of the continent that saw new population centers arise.
And they were coming to the New World in increasing numbers. Land to the west was plentiful and presented opportunities to escape the tyrannies of Europe and the restrictions of the seaboard. Thus began a movement westward in the 1760s, which continued until the 20th century, our own time.
Soon enough, the entire eastern deciduous forest hosted a burgeoning number of new settlements, and nothing was safe. To understand the true scale of this invasion, we only need to look at the next bird driven to extinction here. While the Labrador duck was already quite rare by the time the first Europeans arrived, the Heath Hen was an incredibly common bird, inhabiting a wide range spanning from New Hampshire all the way down to Virginia. And it was actually this abundance that attracted the attention of settlers for its potential as a reliable food source across the American wilderness. Now, checking back to our guide and going to page 122, we'll find that unlike the other birds we're going to look at today, this bird isn't actually mentioned in this book at all. See? Nothing. But I think I know why. You see, the Heath Hen wasn't a fully realized species, but rather was a subspecies, Tympanicus cupido, of a far more prevalent bird, Tympanicus cupido, or the greater prairie chicken. And sure enough, look, we'll find it listed right here. But okay, let's look at a distribution map for the prairie chicken. Doing this, we'll see that this bird typically keeps to the western United States, the part of the country that's actually prairie, and seldom ventures this far east. But the Heath Hen was the member of its species that broke this trend, having crossed the Appalachian Mountains to establish and maintain a population entirely separate from the rest along the East Coast. And if we've learned anything about geographic isolation by now, it's that it breeds speciation, which is why we can see the Heath Hen was in the process of becoming its own species. While their relatives further west preferred the grassy expanses of prairie, the Heath Hen preferred, well, heath or heathlands, where shrubs and pine trees grow over sandy, acidic soils. This difference in environments led the birds to develop their very own behaviors and even unique plumages, distinguishing them from their more general relatives on the prairie. Given the prevalence of heathlands across the East Coast, this environment managed to support huge populations of the bird prior to the establishment of the first colonies. But being a relative of the chicken, a bird Europeans were well familiar with eating, the Heath Hen was targeted for hunting from the moment the first settlers arrived on American shores, and quickly became the main source of protein for many settlers. In fact, it's thought by some historians that the first Thanksgiving dinners were centered around heath hens rather than turkeys. By 1791, when the US was only 15 years old, the heath hen was already showing signs of mass population decline. And in what was one of the very first attempts at conservation within the country, or really anywhere, the New York State Legislature introduced an act for the preservation of heath hen and other game in an attempt to prevent the total loss of the bird. Despite many at the time mistaking the word heath hen for heathen, a word derogatively used towards the natives, the bill ultimately passed, also becoming some of the first conservation legislation ever to make it into law. Unfortunately, this turned out to be unenforceable. I mean, you try telling a bunch of people running around and living in the woods to stop eating the birds. And so, hunting continued throughout New York, as well as the rest of the East Coast states. Eventually, the heath hen's function in colonial America as the cheap and accessible meat product meant that by 1870, around the same time the last Labrador duck was shot, all mainland populations of the hen were declared extinct, with the only known remaining population being a group of around 300 individuals living on Martha's Vineyard, a small island off the coast of Massachusetts. Here, the hen population fluctuated all the way down to 70 and all the way up to 2,000. But a massive fire on the island in 1916 sealed their fate once and for all. By 1927, only 11 males and 2 females remained. By 1928, just a year later, only a single male was left. Nicknamed Booming Ben for the breeding call he continued to put out, he had no way of knowing he was the last of his kind, and he never received a reply. The last time Booming Ben was seen was 4 years later in 1932, just as a new breeding season was beginning, and it's thought he died not long after. Okay, so far we've seen how the arrival of settlers can push already threatened animals past their breaking point and can hunt even the most seemingly abundant creatures out of existence. But our next bird reveals how even when doing seemingly everything right, a species can still fall victim to something even worse than habitat loss or overhunting, and have its entire population wiped out before we even know what's happening. You see, the Carolina parakeet tasted horrible. Being the only indigenous parrot found across the whole of the eastern US, I wasn't actually expecting to be able to find it in this book, but well, Roger Torrey Peterson thought of everything. And so on page 198, the page that's dedicated to all the different types of pet parrots and parakeets that have escaped captivity and gone on to establish their own introduced populations, we can see the Carolina parakeet gets its own inset, distinguishing it as the only endemic species on the page. And hang on, wait, can we just take a second to appreciate just how beautiful this bird was? I mean, the fact that a tropical bird managed to establish a native population deep into the temperate zone blows my mind, and this might be the bird I regret never getting to see in the wild the most. In fact, the Carolina parakeet was so successful in this arena that it actually branched into 2 subspecies of its own, Conuropsis carolinensis and Conuropsis carolinensis ludovicianus, which was notable for its more bluish coloration. Together, these parakeets established a range across much of the eastern United States, though the Appalachian Mountains again helped to isolate the two subspecies, with Ludovicianus preferring the more northwestern interior, while carolinensis mostly stuck to the southeastern coasts. What made these birds so special, however, was their preferred food source, the North American cocklebur. This particular diet gave these parakeets two important characteristics that actually led to their prolonged survival. First, the cocklebur's seeds were toxic and often outcompeted crops humans were trying to grow, simultaneously poisoning the soils around them. Therefore, the parakeet's preference for eating the noxious weeds actually made them a useful animal for controlling what was considered to be an agricultural pest, earning them a valued role among settlers. Second, relying mainly on toxic seeds made the Carolina parakeets themselves poisonous to eat, and while one wouldn't kill you, there are reports of people's cats dying after eating them. In the end, this diet made these birds both valuable to humans for protecting their crops and also got them taken off the hunt this bird for food list. Meaning of any of the birds mentioned so far, these had the best chances of striking up a symbiotic relationship with the land's new arrivals. Even the birds' preferred nesting areas within wetland forests and swamps helped them avoid places where people liked to settle. Inhabiting an area of roughly 2.5 million square kilometers at approximately 2 birds per kilometer gives us an estimated population of about 5 million birds. And knowing they tended to flock together in places seldom witnessed by humans at the time, this number could have been much higher. Despite this, their numbers were still being noted as in decline as early as the 1800s, mostly due to deforestation. But as late as 1896, huge flocks were still being witnessed flying across the country. By 1904, or less than 10 years later, however, the bird had become exceedingly rare, and people were already bringing up the possibility that it was extinct. But there were still plenty of places for the birds to nest, plenty of food for them to eat, and very little incentive for people to hunt them. For the people at the time, the bird's disappearance didn't make any sense. So then what was behind the demise of these amazing birds? Well, we don't know, or at least we don't have enough evidence to say one way or another. But the most common theory is really the only thing that could wipe out a full species faster than overhunting or habitat loss ever could: disease. Specifically a strain of poultry disease known as Newcastle disease. The earliest record of this came from Scotland in 1898, where the entire domestic fowl population was decimated. However, the disease was only properly identified in 1926, meaning for nearly 30 years it wreaked havoc throughout chicken populations without farmers knowing what was behind it. And not long after its first appearance in Europe, Newcastle arrived in the United States, where it spread from the domestic chickens to many of the wild birds, one of which being the Carolina parakeet. This, combined with other anthropogenic factors, led the population to continue crashing until 1918, when the last captive member of the species, a bird known as Incas in the Cincinnati Zoo, died 8 years before the disease that likely wiped them out was even identified. Soon after, reports of wild sightings diminished as well, and eventually by 1920 the bird was officially declared extinct. In a dark bit of irony, the cage Incas died in at the Cincinnati Zoo just so happened to be the very same cage the last member of our final extinct bird species also died in just 4 years earlier, Martha the passenger pigeon. Now, I should probably predicate this by saying that before making this video, while I had heard of passenger pigeons before and I knew they were extinct, well, that was about all I knew about them, and I didn't even know that they were native to this area. But after reading up on them for this video, wow, I really should have been taught more about them as a kid. Checking back to our book, and we'll find pigeons only a page away from parrots on page 196, where we'll see passenger pigeons extinct. That's literally all this book says on them, and knowing what I know now just feels wrong. You see, as a true native of the eastern deciduous forest, the passenger pigeon had a population centered around the Great Lakes. Here, oak trees dominate the plant community, and although there are many different species, every oak tree has at least one thing in common. They produce acorns. And if you know anything about acorns, it's probably that plenty of small forest animals like squirrels love to eat them, and even bury huge supplies of them underground to return to during the long winter. While being the source of food for so many species has definitely made oak trees important to the local wildlife, for oak trees this is kind of a worst case scenario. I mean, think about it, these are their seeds after all, and so if animals eat them all up, then they can't successfully reproduce, and well, pretty soon there will be no more trees. To counteract this, oak trees developed a behavior called masting. Basically, once every few years, oak trees within a given area will produce way more acorns than usual, in order to overwhelm the animals that feed off them, ensuring that at least some acorns are left uneaten and can grow into new trees, allowing the forest to perpetuate itself and keep the entire ecosystem alive. But pigeons, well, pigeons are pretty smart, at least as far as birds go, and they figured out a way to take advantage of this. You see, if they behaved like most birds and kept to a single small area, they'd only receive a mast year every once in a while, and ultimately their populations would be limited by the food available during non-mast years. But because these forests are full of different kinds of oak trees, all with their own separate mast cycles, if the birds constantly migrated across the region, hopping from grove to grove of masting trees, they'd gain access to vastly more food than any single area could ever produce. This habit of perpetual migration is in turn what earned the birds their names, coming from the French word, I'm sorry for this, passager, which meant passing by, as they were literally always on the move, seeking out new sources of food. This strategy of relying solely on the mast of different areas in turn allowed the passenger pigeon population to climb to absolutely astounding heights. At their peak, just before Europeans arrived, somewhere between 3 to 5 billion passenger pigeons were estimated to have lived in this region, making them not only by far the most populous bird in North America, consisting of up to 40% of the continent's entire bird population, but this very well could have made them the most populous bird on the planet, despite having only a decently sized range. To get a better sense of just how prevalent these birds truly were, I'd like us to read a passage from the book Ornithological Biography, written by this man, John James Audubon, the legendary American naturalist and artist, responsible for many of the prints already featured in this video. In his attempt to enumerate the birds as they passed over him, he wrote,
I dismounted, seated myself on an eminence, and began to mark with my pencil, making a dot for every flock that passed. In a short time, finding the task which I had undertaken impracticable, as the birds poured in countless multitudes, I rose, and counting the dots, then put down, found that 163 had been made in 21 minutes. I traveled on, and still met more the further I proceeded. The air was literally filled with pigeons. The light of noonday was obscured as by an eclipse, and the continued buzz of wings had a tendency to lull my senses to repose. Before sunset, I reached Louisville, distant from Hardinsburg 55 miles. The pigeons were still passing in undiminished numbers and continued to do so for 3 days in succession.
And what Audubon witnessed was more or less a common occurrence across the entire region. Though perhaps the greatest account of a single passenger pigeon flock comes from southern Ontario, where a flock a mile wide and over 300 miles long passed overhead, taking over 14 hours to pass. With these dimensions, it's estimated that up to 3.5 billion pigeons could have been in this flock alone. To say that there were a lot of these birds would be an understatement. There were more of these birds than you can even imagine, more than twice the number of people on the planet at the time. Had I been around just a little more than 100 years ago, it's certain that not only would I have seen these birds, I probably would have seen them every day. Now, by this point, I bet you're wondering, well, if these birds were so numerous, what could possibly have driven them to extinction? And well, with population numbers this big, I'll admit it's really hard to attribute the demise of the passenger pigeon to any single cause, but rather it was a result of all the causes of extinction we've learned about so far working together. First off, their abundance made passenger pigeons exceedingly easy to hunt. Literally, all you had to do was point your gun towards the sky and shoot. But as early settlers of the land grew to depend on the passenger pigeon, hunting techniques advanced rapidly. And soon enough, we'd built contraptions using nets, funnels, tunnels, a giant pole thing that I don't really understand how it worked. Heck, we even started burying sulfur beneath their nests to suffocate them. Or in short, it didn't take us long to perfect multiple different strategies for the industrial scale hunting of these birds. This, by and large, was the primary driving force behind the collapse of their population. But of course, at the same time, they were also losing huge areas of habitat to human development, and their extremely social nature allowed foreign diseases such as Newcastle disease to tear through their flocks. While many factors went into their extinction, they all had one thing in common: humans, and specifically settlers. The lesson to be learned here is that this isn't the only place where something like this happened. Trust me, no matter if you live in the United States, Canada, Mexico, the entirety of Central and South America, all the way to Australia and New Zealand, if you live in a place that was settled within the past few hundred years, the same thing happened there as well. And if you do come from one of these places, I urge you to do some research of your own and try to find out what birds used to live there. And of course, be sure to share your findings in the comments. Now, before I end this video, I want to address a comment I get a lot of whenever I make videos like this about extinction.
Most species that have ever lived are extinct, and most people who have ever lived close to the bone. Atlas Pro can sit back smug and pontificate on where people should have gotten their food and clothing. He's a well-off New Yorker who never had to worry about a meal or warm clothing. People once risked their lives to club those great auks to death.
Humans are as much a part of nature as the auk. In this case, humans serve as an extinction vector through predation.
Extinction is the norm. It bothers me that people are emotional about this stuff.
I mean, why does it matter if some animals go extinct? Not like they are all that important.
But obviously that's not true, and we can find a perfect example of why this is in the passenger pigeon. You see, without the pigeon to consume most of the massed harvest, other animals have since taken the bird's place. One of these is the innocent enough white mouse, which have been exploding in population since the early 1900s. Now, having a few more mice in a forest in itself isn't so bad, but the issue comes from what feeds off these mice, not a predator, but a parasite, a mite known commonly as ticks. Now, the life cycle of ticks is a little complicated, but all you really need to know is that with more mice, there are more ticks, and especially more ticks infected with the bacterium Borrelia. In the next stage of their life, when they attach to larger animals like deers, dogs, or humans, their feeding off our blood can introduce this bacteria into our bodies and cause a disease known as Lyme disease. Now, if you've never heard of Lyme disease before, well, lucky you, as it initially causes huge bullseye rashes along with fevers, and in the long term can cause severe headaches, intense joint pain, heart palpitations, inflammation of the brain and spinal cord, facial palsy, and in the worst cases, if left untreated, even death. And this is where things get personal, as I have Lyme disease. I got it when I was a kid who liked to play in the forest. My brother has Lyme disease. My mom has Lyme disease. And it's one of those diseases where once you get it, even if you're treated for the symptoms, it never goes away. And I still feel its effects to this day. And while I can't directly link me getting Lyme disease to the disappearance of the passenger pigeon, cases of Lyme disease in this part of the country have been growing rapidly, and more people are suffering as a result, in no small part due to the bird's disappearance. I mean, how weird is it to think that I might, and my whole family might live shorter lives because a bunch of people exterminated a bird more than a century ago? Ultimately, what I want you to take away from this is that the Earth is one insanely complex system, a system of systems, and we really have no clue how our actions might indirectly affect ourselves for generations to come. After all, Lyme disease was only identified in 1975, 60 years after the last passenger pigeon died in the Cincinnati Zoo, which means we really had no way of understanding the effects their mass slaughter could have had on us. But rest assured, the more we mess with the Earth's natural system of checks and balances, the more we open up the possibility for our own destruction. To wrap things up, while learning about all these different birds I could have witnessed had I only been born 100 years ago, or if we hadn't just killed them all, definitely makes me sad. It also helps me appreciate the birds that still remain. Despite what this whole video might have made you think, there are still some really beautiful birds here, with blue jays and cardinals being some of my favorites. But if this book is any clue, there are plenty of others to see too. So let's learn from our mistakes and not let any more of our natural wealth be lost in something as senseless as greater profits, or else we might be the ones who pay the price.
In that world, denizens of the wilderness surveyed a vast domain over which they held undisputed sway. Here, countless creatures of the wild found protection and sanctuary.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching and I hope you enjoyed. I had a lot of fun making this and especially using this to tell part of that story. What do you think? Would you like to see more videos utilizing this or other books on my shelf? Let me know. The only extinct bird I didn't get to talk about was the great auk, which had a natural range from Cape Cod all the way to Western Europe. And the reason I didn't do that is because, well, I already made another, I already made another video about it. You see it right there? I already made another video about it right here, so go check that out if you want to see more about that. Oh, and shout out to the YouTube channel LesleytheBirdNerd. I found her channel while researching for this video, and besides lending her voice to John James Audubon, helped me out with this video a little. So if you enjoyed learning about birds with me, you'll definitely enjoy learning about them with her. So make sure to go check out her channel. The link will be probably on screen and in the description. Of course, if you want to help these videos get made, you can check out my Patreon, just like all these generous people going by on screen. Lastly, subscribe so that I can finally enter the 1 million subscribers club, and make sure to like this video if you think there's an important lesson to be learned here, and remember to share what amazing birds your homeland used to have before you settled it. Thanks.